Well, thank you very much for having me here in Australia, and it was a pleasure to be able to say I was coming to Tasmania because I've always wanted to come here, so I'm very pleased. So Lori failed to tell you that at that particular meeting, the American Probation and Parole Association meeting, I had prepared this unbelievable PowerPoint presentation only to learn that the organization did not have PowerPoints. And so I had to use finger puppets to make my point. And I was a little rattled because I only found that out about a half an hour before the presentation. So I promise today that I'll minimize the use of finger puppets in my talk because I do have the opportunity to use PowerPoint. I'm going to talk a little bit and build off some of the themes that Mr. Williams provided. But my focus is going to be on two particular aspects. One is to basically focus in on what we're learning from the research on effective practices in community supervision, because we are actually a time in history, both in the United States but around the world, where there is more research now being done in community corrections than at any time. My career over the last 30 years, it's always been a struggle to be able to do research in community corrections organizations, mainly because the interest was in incarceration, as we all know. But there's really much more of a focus right now on trying to really understand how do we build effective community correctional organizations to prevent incarceration. So it's not just about, community corrections being a stepchild. It's really about this notion that we need to have effective systems of care so that we can prevent the use of the most expensive and also the most harmful part of state control, which is incarceration. So I'm going to kind of share with you the results from a number of studies, kind of interspersed. I'm also going to share with you kind of some toys that we've developed that are all free on my website, so you can download some things off of my website or go play with them. We're really trying to develop some translational tools for the field to deal with some of the issues that Mr. Williams touched on, which is knowing what types of program services are effective for what types of offenders. So let's begin. So first of all, I have to acknowledge all the great people I work with and also the funding sources that allow me to have fun as I develop some of these translational tools. So I'm going to move a little bit because of these lights. Okay, so I'm also going to reference specifically evidence-based practices in the context of the risk needs responsivity model. But I want to recognize that there are other emerging models that are out there, and one obviously here in Australia, the Good Lives model, is far more prevalent here than in the United States and England and other places around the world, although there's increasing interest right now in the Good Lives model. And then there's a new framework called desistance that I believe some of you probably have heard from Fergus McNeill, who's at the University of Glasgow in Scotland. And Fergus and a number of colleagues have really been focusing in on a conceptual model that's really about how to help people exit from a life of crime, how to help people begin to deal with the brick walls. And I see these three frameworks as being significantly different than our deterrence or control-based models, mainly because of an emphasis on client-centeredness, mainly because of an emphasis on really trying to engage the person in better decision-making about how they can improve their lives. So my reference is going to be on the R&R, but I think there are some themes. Unfortunately, it's emerging literature on the Good Lives model as it applies to community supervision, as well as on desistance. Okay. So I'm going to cover the risk needs responsivity model. I'm going to talk about it in the context of a mass incarceration era. So in Australia, do you all refer to your time frame as being mass incarceration? No. Well, so this is relatively new in the U.S. It's only emerged over the last 3 to 4 years, where we have come to terms with the fact that the U.S. has basically used incarceration as the primary tool, and that the policies and practices that guide the increased use of punishment have created a culture of mass incarceration, so that it affects how the clients of our system, people who are involved in the justice system, behave. It affects how communities respond, and it impacts how the people who work in the system respond, because there's an expectation that incarceration is the main tool of punishment and justice throughout our system. Now, recently, and you'll hear me talk about this a little bit more, but we had a very large national review that was basically done by the National Research Council called The Causes and Consequences of Mass Incarceration in Our Society. And I have to say that this is probably one of the most thoughtful scientific reviews from a historical perspective, but also from a perspective about human rights and social justice, in which really this national research report basically came up with the notion that the overuse of incarceration has created so many perils in our society and also so many negative consequences that we really have to rethink what is justice in our communities. And so there's an notion that in the context of mass incarceration, risk, needs, responsibility, or the management of offenders and community supervision has to be equivalent to a punishment model that is based upon 24-hour confinement structures. And so one of the issues in terms of uptake of risk, needs, responsivity, and effective supervision is how to do that, recognizing some of the human rights issues and social justice issues. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit, and then I'm going to kind of build on this notion that the risk, needs, responsivity model, I'm going to call it R&R because that responsivity, which is not really a word, is always a tongue tire for me. So anyway, so it's a tool for system change, particularly if it's not confined to just the justice organizations or community corrections, but is actually something that our stakeholders, judiciary, prosecutors, defenders, treatment, folks use. Okay. So let's see. All right, now, whoops, okay. So this is the tool, it's on my website. It's called the R&R Simulation Tool. What we've done here is we've tried to provide some strategic planning tools that can be used both at the client level, let's see if this all works, at the client level to facilitate information sharing and better matching of risk and needs with different types of programs and services. At the program level to give us feedback, and I'll give you a little bit of description here. And then at a jurisdictional capacity, which can be at an agency, it could be at a country, it could be at a city, but essentially give you some ideas about what types of programs and services do we really need to help people improve the quality of life and reduce their criminal activity. And then we have an e-learning component, evidence mapping, that I'm not really going to go through. So the nice thing about our model, this all builds on a national database. Of course, it's specific to the U.S., but there are techniques to be able to modify it to other jurisdictions, which I can explain not here, but in private if you want to talk through it. But the underlying model is really based upon this notion that if we know the characteristics of clients, so this one is a Caucasian male, 16 to 27 years old, who would have been ranked high risk on a risk and needs tool, doesn't matter what tool. And then we have another series need variables, and then what is their likely outcome? In this case, they actually were recidivist or rearrested. And then information about how frequent that occurs. And then we have different options, because we're doing simulation modeling here, to look at if you place this person based on their risk and needs, what kind of outcomes would you get from different types of programs and services that this particular person would actually result in. So the simulation model kind of is essentially a decision-making tool to help facilitate some of the harder decisions that, caseworkers or probation officers or judges often have, which is people are complicated, and it's often difficult to know which program or service might be better suited for what type of person. So we've built this model, and you can kind of play with it. And I'm just using this as an example, so you understand this as I kind of walk through my talk. Okay, so I hope you can see this. So this is my attempt to color code our state of knowledge about what works in community corrections and programming for people involved in the justice system. So as you can imagine, the things in red, can you see that there? Okay, the things in red, it's rather dim up here. So the things in red basically have been found by the literature, the research literature, to be ineffective. They don't work. The things on the left-hand side, these are more clinical type programming, and the things on the right-hand side are generally criminal justice programming. And so everything in red has been found to be ineffective, or in some cases actually cause some more criminogenic effects. The kind of beigey color in the middle, we kind of put that as a promising category. And the reason it's promising is because there's mixed results in the literature right now. And those mixed results generally come down to how well was that program or idea implemented within that particular study that was conducted. All right. Oh, that's much better. Thank you, Ingrid. And then in the green here is what we actually know is effective, and that there is a cumulative body of literature. This is based on meta-analysis results. A cumulative body of literature that basically says if we implement these types of programs or these types of criminal justice programs, then we are likely to increase the likelihood to reduce recidivism among people involved in the justice system and to get better outcomes. So this is based on what's called systematic review, which is just a mechanism of synthesizing the literature. And I like to color code this because it's easy then for us to kind of say, okay, we shouldn't be doing anything in red. We should not be doing, we probably need to pay attention to the beige items. And when I say pay attention, I'm talking about the quality of the implementation and the fidelity to what the underlying component is. And if we really want to maximize our results, then we need to be working ourselves into really implementing these types of programs and services for the offender population. Now, what's interesting about this, so I've been doing this kind of color-coded map last 20 some odd years. So first of all, this item here, incarceration, is new. So we actually have an accumulation of scientific literature that demonstrates that incarceration contributes to offending. Now, from a public policy standpoint, this was a major breakthrough in the last 5 years in the United States, that the researchers who do deterrence work, Dan Nagin, Alex Paccoa, other folks like that, have basically come to the conclusion that incarceration has no impact, or it has what's called an iatrogenic effect, which means that it increases the likelihood of recidivism instead of decreases, which means that, we can actually do harm by the use of incarceration. And then the other new kind of item is this item here called the risk needs responsivity supervision. And the reason this is important, I think this is the most important aspect, is because it actually gives credence to how important community correction is and can be. And if we want to implement effective models for community corrections, this is the framework that we should really be drawing our attention. So, any questions on this list before I move forward? Yes?
Why is case management up in the to-do list and R&R supervision is in the effective list? Just explain the difference between those two.
Yeah. Excellent question. I've actually been thrown out of a room by having case management in red. So, people get very upset, you know, because the actual literature on case management is really not supportive of the process by which people are basically, assessed and then dealt with. And so the case management literature overall uses a variety of different case management strategies, so there's no real solid definition of what case management is. And the focus of attention is generally on referring people to programs and services. And the bottom line is we can refer all day long, but unless people walk through the door and spend a little time there, they're not going to get an impact. So case management, which is primarily focused on just referring people to appropriate services, does not appear to work. But the R&R supervision model, which is much more about the probation officer being an active ingredient in helping people walk through that front door and encouraging people to stick with it, even if the programs and services are uncomfortable, but try and get an impact, that seems to be what the major difference is. And so the research literature on case management just is not supportive of the model. And the research literature on R&R is more specific about what those key components look like. Does that make sense? Other questions about this list? Yes? Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry, geographically. So in the U.S., there's something called the Treatment Alternatives to Street Crime, which is a bridge organization that does assessment and placement and monitoring of people and services. And they usually work hand in hand with probation agencies themselves. So there's sort of a linkage kind of model. And why it's in this sort of neutral color here is that because task programs that actually monitor service participation are effective, but the components that don't monitor service, that just do the referral, are not. But they kind of fall under the same literature base. Okay. So if you have questions, feel free to ask me later on. But this list is really important because actually this year, Dan Nagin, who is a deterrence researcher, won the Stockholm Prize in criminology with Joan Petersilia, and Dan, was primarily recognized for his work to basically suggest or prove scientifically that incarceration has this iatrogenic effect. So the question then becomes, what is it, this R&R supervision? What does it look like? And then how do we get probation and parole agencies to embrace it, to sustain it, not to be kind of a fleeting pattern here? So recently, Elizabeth Drake, who's with the Washington State Institute for Public Policy, did a meta-analysis looking at probation supervision models. And she compared a traditional ISP model, which means more face-to-face contacts, with ISP when people actually have referrals to treatment as part of their conditions of supervision. So those are generally judicially ordered, with this R&R supervision model. And she essentially found that in the available literature that the R&R supervision model has the likelihood of reducing recidivism by 16%, whereas the traditional face-to-face supervision model, which is ISP, has a null effect on recidivism. Now again, this is counterintuitive because, of course, we think that the more contacts probation officers have with probationers, the more likely it is that we will reduce recidivism. But essentially, what we've actually learned in the research literature is that when the contacts are these monitoring contacts, you know, just checking in with people, seeing how they're doing, that it actually increases more technical violations. Or as a friend of mine says, you know, the more you know about people, the more you start wondering how well they're actually doing. And so the ISP model has been basically discussed for almost 20 years as being not effective as a way of supervising offenders. Adding treatment has been found to be effective under an ISP model, but the most effective model is the risk needs responsivity supervision. So what this looks like is essentially something that Mr. Williams alluded to, and in my conversations with people here last night and a little bit today, is something I'm sure many of you are very familiar with and probably haven't thought of calling it the risk needs responsivity model. So maybe now I'll give you a new label to be able to do that. So essentially, the whole focus of R&R supervision is that using risk and needs assessment tools, we basically can determine what is the appropriate level of treatment and controls that this particular individual needs. Now, I'm not going to go into the R&R model and a big critique of it because it's really emerging, and there's some new articles actually in an online publication called Federal Probation. So if you just Google Federal Probation, Administrative Office of the Courts for the United States, there is an article by Jim Bonta and Guy Bourgeon on understanding responsivity, and there's an article by Faye Taxman on a second-generation model of responsivity, and you know, there's other articles that really kind of define this term a little bit more. But what the salient, what the salient point here about using is that essentially we need to get past just conducting a risk needs assessment tool and making sure it's actually used both in case planning and in helping the cognitive restructuring of the offender population or probationer to really understand what are the dynamic risks and needs. Now, it's an interactive model, in other words. It's not dormant, it's not stagnant. It's this notion that the risk needs should really be something that's part of a conversation. So I don't know that much about some of your probation services, and I apologize for my ignorance, but I can tell you in the United States, we have two major issues with this whole notion about using. So the first one is that probation officers are reluctant to share their risk needs assessment tools and information with their clients. So in other words, if they assess the person to be moderate risk and have, you know, certain dynamic needs in employment areas or families, they don't really feel that they should share that information. Now, is that a common occurrence here in Australia? No. Well, that's good. But it's something that is a problem in us really thinking about implementation because, you know, all of these implementation models are really looking at this concept of fidelity. So I would challenge you to really talk with and work with your staff around how comfortable they are in discussing some of these dynamic risk areas and need areas with the clients. And I'm not talking about it at the end of an intake interview. I'm speaking about it more through the probation process. So, you know, as the phrase I like to use, when things are going good, we need to congratulate people and let them know that this is that they're making progress, but always remind them of some of the factors that have gotten in the way in the past, because they need to push through those issues. When things are not going good, it's a good opportunity to really go back to the risk and needs tool and think through, okay, I'll get used to this thing, what levels of controls actually occur. So the first part of the R&R model is really about using information to guide case planning and program placement. The second part is an extremely important part, again, an area that we struggle with tremendously in the U.S., which is building the offender's engagement in the services that they are actually involved in and the motivation to change. And a lot of officers, and some of this has to do with the training or the lack of training that we actually provide. So we have a lot of people who talk about using MI, but they talk about using MI from the context of, I don't ask closed questions. Like, that's the context of MI. But that's not really what motivational interviewing is about. Because it's really about engaging people, much more so in their own case planning and their own thinking about how they're going to resolve issues. And so a big part of the R&R framework is really about engagement. And I emphasize that as compared to motivation, because we don't oftentimes think about this notion that, people can be motivated, but really, if they haven't taken the actions and steps to really engage in something, then they're not likely to get a lot of benefit from it. Okay. And then this third bullet about involving the offenders in the case planning process. Now, again, this may be something that's commonplace here, but in the U.S., we tend to go through very quickly the risk and needs assessment tool. There's usually a form for case planning. Now that we have management information systems, sometimes the systems create the case plan, and we're done, right? But that's not really involvement. That's not giving people choices. And I really like to think more so that the underlying framework of the R&R model is much more about a shared decision-making framework in which the client, the probationer, basically makes some of those choices. So even though we as professionals may think that we know what treatment or controls are in the best interest of the client, it's sort of like my doctor knowing what's in the best interest of Faye to deal with her asthma, but it doesn't make a difference unless I'm bought in that that particular treatment or lifestyle change is in the best interest. And that's the same issue here, is that we really have to help people become much more active in the case planning process, because that is the process by which change actually occurs. All right, and then last is this notion about using the probation contacts as a way of helping people to recognize and manage their own triggers or their own situations, people, places, and things, that basically get in the way of really trying to make progress. Because we all know that there's going to be bumps in the road. Life is hard. People have complicated lives. They have lots of challenges. And so part of this notion is really much more of helping people to think through kind of how they can restructure their situations in order to be able to minimize the impact of those triggers that are likely to occur. So this is a very broad framework. I could go on for hours, but I don't have time. Any questions? Yes?
I just don't quite understand. What is the difference between R&R supervision and case management? To me, this is case management.
So, this could be contextually different. But in most case management, the focus is on basically conducting a risk and needs assessment tool and then referring people to appropriate services. The processes that are embedded in here in terms of really working on engagement and working on trigger analysis and working through a case plan, those are added on features that are typically not in what people do as part of case management. And this could be very different from how you currently do it in your organization. But if you look at the research literature on the description of case management, it usually focuses attention on essentially conducting an assessment and referring people to services. It doesn't focus attention on as much as trying to get the client involved in some of the decision making. And so I think that's the distinction.
So can I just add, I think part of the issue is from an academic perspective and a policy perspective, there's a real difference between the States and Australia in terms of the terminology. So in Australia, we don't so much use the term supervision because it means what you're saying the R&R style of case management supervision is. So that's for us the case management. That's how we term it, and supervision is what you're saying case management is, which is that more kind of superficial. So I think that's where the cultural disconnect might be coming from, or the confusion. So it's definitely cultural.
Well, I think also as part of the mass incarceration movement in the U.S., probation supervision moved away from using the term case management almost 25 years ago because that was perceived to not be an enforcement and monitoring perspective. And so there is a lot of hesitancy from probation agencies with really talking about being case managers. Like probation officers would not, except for in the youth system in our country. But, you know, I'm also kind of, you know, if you look other places around the world, like in Canada or in the UK or in Sweden, the term case management is not how probation officers perceive their situation. So this, you know, it could be that you all, you know, luckily didn't kind of have to deal with some of the mass incarceration, which helped, you know, redefine these roles. But the research literature essentially finds, and this is, I'll talk about this a little bit later, but in training of probation officers now, the emphasis, either whether it's in Canada or a number of different curriculums that exist in the US right now, is really training people on offender engagement and how to involve offenders in the case planning process. And then the terminology that tends to be used is problem solving, teaching people problem solving skills. And so, you know, we separate out the case management, which is generally just doing the assessment and referrals, from this kind of more entrenched approach. So, you know.
We've had the opposite shift in language.
Uh-huh.
So in the idea of taking on more collaborative, which is what you're talking about, we endorse more the case management terminology to reflect that in Australian practice, and whereas supervision is more about order enforcement and referral for us. And I think this is where part of the confusion might be for this audience. I hope that adds something.
No, I mean, you know, it's important. I hope the point that I'm trying to get across, though, is from a research literature and effectiveness standpoint. So there is a recognition that the enforcement component is important, particularly because you're talking about public safety and you're talking about risk management. But the enforcement component is really defined around helping the person to really think through kind of what's boundaries that they need to, you know, impose upon themselves as a way of trying to make progress on these dynamic risk factors and need factors. Yeah.
Just kind of related, in the history of probation services, social work was seen as the appropriate qualification at one time for someone working in the probation program area.
So in the history of probation, you're right, the framework was much more from a social work lens. And of course, over time, the focus on enforcement emerged. And then, a lot of criminal justice programs is where a lot of people who work in probation are now drawn from. And at least in the United States, and also this is an issue in Europe, most of those probation programs do not have mandates that people have psychology or social work backgrounds. So Scotland, for example, basically calls their probation officer criminal justice social workers, but they don't have to have a social work degree to actually be able to do that. So what that means, and I think, that's probably a large implication, is when people enter the workforce as a probation officer, they don't necessarily have some of the people skills or the abilities to be able to do some of the case analysis, the assessment planning, and work with the clients to work through some of these issues. And I think that's part of why we've seen a generation now of curriculums being introduced within probation settings to basically train and coach people so that they can really perfect some of these skills that they don't bring onto the job. So I don't know here in Australia, is it a mandate that probation officers come from a social work background?
No, it's not.
Yeah.
I do agree with you. I think that involving offenders in case planning and engaging them in the process, motivation and change, is skills and like resources to go into that interview and know what they're going to be doing during that interview, and then to be able to sort of gauge the effectiveness of that interview based on what they set out to achieve. I think we often go with very cold, just get information, we do the assessment, we draw up a case plan, but we're not necessarily good at engaging and leading that process.
Well, this is the challenge that we find, and part of what I said before about how probation officers in the states don't want to share information, we've actually learned that part of that is they don't understand it. So if you actually know that a person, it's easy to know when someone has a substance use disorder. That's kind of low-hanging fruit. It's harder to really know what criminal thinking is. Because the construct of criminal thinking is pretty murky, and in some places it's, good defense mechanisms, in some cases it's survival. And so what we've actually found is that this whole notion about helping to build the knowledge of the staff to be able to be comfortable. If you're going to talk to someone about their criminal lifestyle, are you going to talk about things that are really criminal lifestyles or not? Are you going to talk about, what's on the instrument, but that instrument, may not have that much meaning per se. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the strategies that we've been using to kind of get at how to build the workforce to really put in place these particular components. Because now that the science, we have this meta-analysis that basically demonstrates that this is an effective process. So we have the science, now we have the issue about uptake. Implementation with fidelity so that staff are using this and so that the organizations are focused on really building the staff's confidence and capabilities to really deliver this. Okay, so the other part of R&R that's important is what is it about this process that is a little bit different? And I think part of the issue, and this, has come up in a number of countries, is that people who are on supervision oftentimes feel that they're just waiting to be revoked. That, failure is around the corner. Unfortunately, the folks involved in the justice systems, have had lots of failures in their life, and they have high expectations. So the process by which we do the R&R supervision model, the case planning, the trigger analysis, is really what I think is this underlying notion of creating procedural justice, a fairness in which the client really feels, the probationer really feels, that the system isn't out to get them, but is really out to help give them some opportunities that they may not necessarily have had. And procedural justice, from what we've seen in the deterrence literature, is an important concept, because when people believe that they're being treated fairly, even if they mess up and they don't really follow through, they put it on their own shoulders that they messed up, that it wasn't the probation officer who was trying to get them. And that's an important change process, because as we all know, change is not linear. You know, it requires a lot of bites at the apple. And one of that bite at the apple is someone actually saying, hey, look it, this is on me. You know, I didn't follow through. I smoked, you know, marijuana. I'm the one that, you know, robbed the store. I did these things, instead of putting it on the officer. So the process by which we use is an important one in terms of this offender involvement. And so the underlying framework of procedural justice, I believe, is kind of one of the most critical components. And what we see in the research literature is far more now this notion about a working relationship, again, borrowing from social work. But in probation, the focus on good working relationships between the probation officer and the probationer has not necessarily been the center of what we think is the it in making something happen. So I'm a scientist, so there's this concept in science called mechanisms of action. I know it's kind of geeky thing, but the whole notion of a mechanism of action is if you know, there's lots of stuff we could do, but if there was one thing we could do, which would get us over the finishing line. And here, the finishing line, according to the procedural justice and the R&R, is that there is enough of a rapport between the probationer and the probation officer. There's enough care and there's enough perception that they're being treated fairly, that the probation officer, probationer, really supports the process of being on probation. And so this working alliance is one of the key dimensions that we believe is actually the mechanisms that makes the R&R supervision model, which I think is really important for staff, right? Because that means that staff really have an obligation in many ways to consider, how is it I am treating people? You know, because we all have good and bad days. We have days where we like people and we don't want to work with them, and we do, right? It's natural, we're human. But, you know, thinking about this is an important component, is a part of the process. And another part of the R&R model is, as we've talked about, kind of understanding the needs. And then I'm not really going to talk about incentivizing here, but mainly because I don't have enough time. But, you know, there is a very strong literature base about how important incentives are much more important in terms of helping people take those stronger, those harder steps than sanctioning people. And so how we can build in small sanctions and not incentives, and I'm not talking about money as the incentive here, I'm talking about other types of social reinforcers that make people feel like they're making progress on supervision. Okay, so now I'm going to turn my attention to the struggles of really trying to implement in large systems like probation with a lot of external partners, right? You have judges, you have prosecutors, you have the public, you have a lot of folks who are, you know, invested. And there's a couple bumps in the road that really affect implementation. So one of them is this notion that people don't naturally come to probation motivated. And so probation officers kind of have this struggle. How do you deal with people who aren't motivated? I'm a professor. I have this struggle all the time. I have people who don't like to read what I assign in class, right? 10 years ago, I used to say, it's on them. And I realized that I have a role to play in this whole motivation piece. Another one is this whole problem we have about not having the right programs and services in place. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those issues. And the last one is the mass incarceration culture and the implications about how we move forward. Because these all interfere with the potential for recidivism reduction. But I should also tell you, as a result of this great report in the U.S., so, Mr. Williams also noted to us this morning that recidivism is an awful measure. So, the authors of this report didn't quite get there, but they did basically acknowledge that we need to be really looking much more about how much progress people have made instead of consistently looking at the failures, which may actually not be a person's fault. So one thing that was noted in this report was that, because of hotspots policing, and we've been able to document this in our research literature, there are certain communities where recidivism rates are higher. Now, is that higher because of the behavior of people in that, or is it higher because of, the policing actions that actually occur? So there's a revisit of recidivism as one of the measures, and I think what we will see 5 years from now is that the focus will be a little bit less on recidivism reduction and a little bit more focus on change in dynamic risk factors. So our degree of success will actually be judged by the degree to which people can change some of those negative factors. So that's another positive piece, but I just wanted to note that because I thought that was very insightful of Mr. Williams to really kind of bring to our attention that maybe the way we're thinking about how well people do on supervision, we need to basically make some changes. Okay. So oftentimes in this motivation problem, probation officers feel like they're just kind of going after one problem after another problem. So we have this great cartoon called Whack-A-Mole where you're basically just trying to hit all the problems. And part of this is because what does it mean to have a motivated probationer? Anybody want to take a guess? What? They do all the work, right? They walk in the office, they're happy, they're smiling, life is grand, but, that's, not likely. So, we have this issue about what is motivation. And part of it, and these are quotes that we've gotten from some of our research, in terms of we do a lot of research and observations with probation officers across the U.S. And, the themes are probationers are lazy, they don't want to make change, people don't care about going back to prison. It's okay, they've been there before, what's the big deal? It's always someone else's fault, that victim stance, and then not sure what they really, why is it the criminal justice system cares about their risk and need factors? So these are all different motivation issues, right? They're complicated because it's not like this is, if you were going to use MI, you'd be thinking about different techniques with MI. Oh, goodness. I'm getting the high sign here. Okay, so we have a problem, and I'm going to rush around it. So one of the things that we've been thinking about also is that when we do the risk needs component, we're really doing risk needs and treating individual dynamic factors separately. So we've been exploring some technology that helps us really look at how to present back to the client And we've been testing this in different places in the U.S., including some rural places, as a way of basically using motivational interviewing techniques to really engage the client in understanding of their own risk-need factors and to be able to start working on case plans. And our goal is to have the client show up at the probation office with their own case plan, so that they can discuss that with the probationer instead of the reverse, where the probation officer says, okay, let's do a case plan, or here's what the judge told you. So we have this intervention called MAP IT. My colleague Scott Walters and I worked on it. It's basically a 2-session right now. It targets motivation using motivational interviewing. It includes risk assessment, planning, social support, and it's really designed to educate and inform the client. What's nice about it is it does a lot of feedback, so that problem that I was saying we have in the States where probation officers aren't necessarily comfortable, it gives people feedback on their static risks, it gives feedback on their dynamic risks, it then also norms for people how their behavior is compared to other people within their age and gender. So for example here, we're looking at alcohol use, and this particular person is in the 65th percentile based on their age. And it gives them kind of a barometer of the impact on their health. So I'm going to basically show you parts of this.
A lot of people have met along the way in and out. The in-house drug system in here, we've got quite a bond right now because we're all going through the same probation program. So we've all been helpful to each other.
I've got a really good support group now that I've never had before. So I have a list of people that I would call if I were in need.
You know, a lot of people think that I'm just BSing, but really a sponsor is really good help. You know, like you can call them about anything and they'll listen, and most of the time, you know, they have experience, been there, done that. You know what I'm saying? So my sponsor has been really helpful. You know, I have some family members that's been, you know, just encouraged me to do the right thing. You know, I've been doing the wrong thing for so long. They just want to see me do right again.
Everyone wants people in their lives who will stick with them through good times and bad times. This is especially true when people are thinking about making changes in drinking or drug use. Successful people know who to talk to and who to ask for help when they need it. In each of the areas, try to think of at least one person you know in that area who you generally can count on to help you. This can be a friend, or just someone you know from that place. It doesn't matter if this person knows you are trying to make changes in alcohol or drug use. When you've typed in a name, just drag it into that area. At the end, each circle should have at least one person in it.
So this is involving a technique of really trying to help the person kind of think about who's in their social network that they can call upon for help, because that's part of the motivation, right? If people are lazy or if they're really overwhelmed by their problems, you know, the question is, who is it within their social network that they can really draw upon? And the motivation piece here is really about trying to help people tease out their environment and then who works with what. So because
This section talks about marijuana use.
this is a feedback.
On the assessment, you reported using marijuana on 88 of the past 90 days. This puts you at the 99th percentile of American women. This means that about 99 out of 100 women use less than you. Marijuana use is reported by about 5% of American women. For some people, marijuana use can cause problems with breathing or memory, or lower the body's ability to fight off diseases. Based on what you said, your estimated risk of having health or social problems is high compared to others. Would you like to know where this information comes from? I compared your responses to a large national survey, the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, conducted in 2010. The survey interviewed people all over the country about their drug and alcohol use.
So part of
This
the
section talks about stimulant use.
I'm gonna. So if you noticed, did you notice the tone? Right. So it was a tone that was really, and believe me, this took a lot of work to computerize this, but really to try to find a balance in trying to help people learn about themselves in a way in which it wasn't subjective and you weren't actually making the person feel uncomfortable or bad about their particular situations. And of course, in a computer, you can kind of do that because you can pre-program this, and there's a lot of tailoring that actually is shown in these small snippets. But the reason I wanted to show that is because there's a hesitancy for us to think about that there are other ways in which we can get people's attention. And what we've learned is actually in this particular, we have a randomized trial that we're doing, so it includes feedback. You know, the person can actually give themselves reminders about different goals that they set. And they can calendar on certain days of the week they want to do certain activities, and it sends it either to their cell phone. We have a new project we're developing right now where actually the person will send it to their probation officer so they can alert the probation officer of some of the steps that they're actually taking. And so I'm just going to show you pretty quickly. So we basically found that about 51% of the folks wanted these reminders, and we also found that essentially people who wanted reminders, particularly email reminders, initiated treatment in a shorter period of time, had less substance use during that same period of time. And so there's different ways in which we can begin to really think about how do we figure out who's motivated and who we're going to have to develop certain attention to. Okay, so that was motivation. I have 5 minutes or less, so I'm going to talk. I have to talk about programs because, you know, and again, I don't know much about Australia, but I can talk a little bit about around the world. So one of the biggest questions is, of course, is the efficacy of the programs that we offer for offenders. How well do they work? How well are they implemented? Do they meet the risk and needs that we're actually designed to do? And so that simulation tool that I showed you up front is really designed to kind of answer this. So one of the big questions I always start with is, how does programs stack up compared to other chronic diseases in terms of relapse? Now, Tom McClellan, who's a researcher, a psychiatrist, did this about 20 years ago as a way of getting people to recognize that drug treatment programs had just as good or better outcomes than asthma or diabetes or other sort of chronic diseases. And you can see here I plotted some data from our federal probation system. So these are relapse rates, and you can see that in a 12-month period of time, people on federal probation in the U.S. actually did better compared to those who had other types of chronic diseases. Now, why is that important? Is because oftentimes our stakeholders don't believe that the programs actually have value. And we struggle in the U.S. with this particular issue. And the little bit I know about different parts of Australia, this is also a theme about how valid are some of these programs and services. Now, there is some legitimacy to this issue about the quality of the programs that we offer. So we have a program tool that you can put in information about your program, and it will rate the program on the quality of the program as compared to the evidence-based practice literature. And why this is important is because if we want community corrections to work well around the world, then we really need to have the supportive programs and services that can be effective. And so if we are offering subpar programming, we need to know about that, and we need to address those issues, and we need to work with our treatment providers to do so. So this is an example of kind of a printout you could get from our simulation tool where it would basically rate the program in different areas. This is not atypical, this particular program being rated 49%. But what this basically does is it targets areas in which the program can actually make strategic goals. So if we were on the computer, it would roll down and tell the program the areas that they need to strengthen their services. This is one jurisdiction in the U.S. that actually went through it with all of their programs. So they had 36 programs. You could see the average program had a score of about 51. And the areas in which people were really low were on the ability to meet the risk needs of the individual. They were pretty high on restrictions that they offered for the program, which is pretty interesting because these were all community-based programs that weren't run by a probation agency. So they had a lot of controls that they actually placed on it. But what this does is it basically challenges us to really deal with the quality of the programs per se. And we can actually translate that then to ask the question, so do those programs, do these 36 programs meet the needs of the clients in that particular system? So we did some mapping, that's from the same jurisdiction, and based using their offender risk needs tools data, we basically took that and plotted what types of programs and services are needed, and then we plotted what they offered. So you can see the discrepancies, right? They have a lot more programs and services that are at the low intensive end, where they have clients who really don't have access to those services. So if we want to know what causes recidivism, part of it is, in the States at least, we put people into any program that's available typically and do less kind of targeting of people into particular types of programs. This is another example of another jurisdiction. They hardly have any programs, right, compared to the needs. But if we want to really convince legislators and our external partners about what the gaps in services are and what those implications are, that's kind of the reason that we developed this particular tool, is to be able to actually do that. So I know I'm running out of time, and I'm sorry to rush through this. Can I have just 3 more minutes? Okay, thank you. So I want to talk now because, you know, when you go back and you look at kind of this idea, which is strategic plan, take information that you already have on the risk needs of clients in your system, compare it to the programs and services of what you're able to do, you know, use that. We bump against a culture in which, you know, at least I can say in the US, but it's really prevalent in the UK right now, where there's an increased interest in incarceration, and in Canada, where there's an increased interest in incarceration, is that we really have to think about this mass incarceration culture and our focus of attention of the justice system being, you know, really focused on incarceration. So David Garland in 2001 he wrote a book called The Culture of Control, which is that by risk management, we think we're controlling public safety. We give ourselves a facade. But what the National Research Council that I referred to in the US has done is they've basically taken that notion that what we really have to do is translate the culture of control into some normative principles. And this really applies to community corrections, because community corrections has often suffered from being the stepchild of a prison system or jails in our communities. And the identity has not necessarily been there. So I challenge you in your, in the work that you do to really think about this, because I'm excited about this in the US, because it's an opportunity to establish an identity of what community corrections is. So in the US, the commission, the National Research Council, basically said that we should define ourselves by normative principles. Now, in my 30 years, I have never seen in criminal justice literature the concept of social justice and inequities being at the forefront. So, for us, it's a really big movement. Notice they didn't say human rights, but they did mention social justice and citizenship, right? So this concept that they raise about citizenship has to really do with us thinking about the implications of justice policies on people being productive citizens of our community. So, you know, community corrections is well placed to help people maintain their productive roles as parents, as contributors, as civic activists. If people can learn to be productive members, and that's kind of an important part. But I think that we have a challenge of really thinking about how we do that effectively so that we don't really, you know, depend upon being the stepchild of, you know, a culture of mass incarceration. So I've outlined for you some ideas, and much of this has to do with this notion that really defining officer behavior with this focus on shared decision making. So if you already have a good, strong social work model here, you guys are probably ahead of the curve. Okay. And we've kind of alluded to that. Talk about training your officers to really use these techniques, and focus on supporting your officers as facilitators of change. So, you know, taking this R&R model, which we know from the research literature is effective, we really think and you really need to figure out a way to embed it within our organizations. Okay, so in the U.S., as I said, and across the world, I'm not sure here in Australia, but you know, there are some different models out there. These are a couple of them. The platform that we use, which is the one that's on our website, is called Soaring 2, and the whole focus is about competency development. These other models, which are traditional training models, you know, and this one's by Jim Bonta's group, and this is by Ed Latessa's group, and this is one that our federal probation system uses. They all have similar principles, you can see that, but the focus is really trying to help embed this into the officers. Now, this is just an example. I'm going to not go through this. I'm not going to go through this because I've been told I'm out of time. But an important role here is to keep coaches, to really develop with your system, you know, a coaching model so you're facilitating staff development. Now, I can't, since I'll be around today and tomorrow, I'm happy to talk more about this. But there are very clear differences, and you can post my slides on your website or distribute them. And of course, you guys have my email address, and we can Skype. But what we have been able to observe is some pretty convincing evidence about the importance of coaching as compared to supervision, as a way of embedding in staff these normative principles about R&R supervision. And coaching is a way of really growing your staff. And so here's an example from that county that had very few programs, Hidalgo County, Texas. And here's another example about just the increase in skills in a 4-month period of time of officers who were not trained social workers, but really learned to use and put in place some of these R&R principles. So, in conclusion, so our focus today about the R&R supervision is that it's evidence-based, it has a solid foundation, and the challenges is really embedding it in probation and community corrections agencies that, as we know, get a lot of pressure from the change pendulum swing over time. And so the ingredients for doing that is really to think about how to improve the probation culture, and I think the normative principles is an important part of that, to really focus in on your officers as the key agents of change so that they realize that the work that they do is the most important work. You know, to go back to what Mr. Williams started out with, people get into this business to make a difference. You guys are all here because you wanted to make a difference in your careers and see ways to do that. And reinforcing to our staff how important that is really critical, because of course it's a draining job to be working with probationers and to also deal with all the issues. Using our risks and needs tools, and then ensuring that what we're doing is of the highest quality. So I'm sorry I had to kind of rush through the last part of my talk this morning. Like I said, I'll be around most of the next couple of days, and I'm happy to chat about anything, and I'm happy to show you if you want to see more of MAP-IT, because we've had a lot of fun sort of putting that together. Thank you. I appreciate it.